Miguel Ruiz, The Four Agreements. Have you read or been introduced to his work
No.
at all? The his one of his four agreements is to be impeccable with your word, and the
Mm.
underpinning of that is, do I come from a space of a generous assumption or a lack of judgment? And it's a challenging, I think, thing for all of us to consider. How do I operate in my life in that way, and what would be the advantages of doing so? So when we consider an opportunity of like living egoically free, or being very mindful of how our ego can operate, taking that approach in life as a principle could be one that helps us to simply have a hyper stance in managing our ego and the impact our ego can have on ourselves and on other people. And yeah, so it's kind of a really interesting take on how many stories we probably can recount in life, just like this gentleman on a train, and all of the assumptions and judgments being made as to why his children are behaving in the way that they do. It's very relatable for us to think about how often we actually do that day in and day out, how many things we just default to judging in a very negative way, as opposed to judging through the lens of optimism or generosity or gratitude.
Mm. Why do we always naturally judge in a negative way?
Yeah, the power of evolution. So we think about how our brain, here comes the scientific part, everybody. When we think
Right.
about how our brain operates
Mhm.
from an evolutionary standpoint, information is synthesized or processed through our amygdala, our threat detection center, and it's looking for perceived threat. Now, when we lived in the cave, the perceived threat was the saber-toothed tiger. Like, we take a look out the cave, is there a tiger? No, okay, it's safe to proceed. Now we're not worried about tigers jumping out, right? So our what we perceive as threats is really anything and everything can be perceived as a threat. And so through our evolutionary process, we're not really just perceiving threatful things as life or death. I could perceive my boss walking towards me as a threat. I could perceive a gentleman's children disruptive on a train as a threat to me. And so my response mechanism is to treat it from a threat standpoint or a negativity bias. I'm looking for what's wrong. I'm looking for where
So
the gap
is
is.
that a good thing? Is that something?
No, not anymore.
Mhm.
We don't really need to look at as much as we're looking at through that lens. And this is the value of our emotional intelligence, is it teaches us to pay attention to the subtle signals of that's what's happening in how I'm processing information, and allow the information to pass through our threat detection system. I mean, like,
Mhm.
no, this isn't a threat. Pass through our emotion centers and understand what emotion information is involved in this, and then get up to our executive functioning, get through to our prefrontal cortex, where we can be rational and logical in our thinking process.
Initially, this conversation was supposed to be between you and Omar Aziz.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to hear that Omar has passed away. Can you highlight a couple things that you both would have talked about so that we can celebrate Omar's legacy?
We can. I'm going to actually make some assumptions and leaps as to what we would have spoken about, because he passed 2 days before we had time for coffee to actually sit down and
Oh,
prepare ourselves.
so sorry.
So what I do know about him, and really appreciate it, as that's why I wanted to have the conversation with him, is his focus is engineering peak performance, and he does that through flow mechanisms and designing protocols, meaning habits that we implement daily that really encourages us to land in our state of flow. There's great synergy between his protocols and flow dynamics and emotional intelligence. In fact, we could have even argued that EI is foundational to his flow mechanics and protocols,
Wow.
meaning we need to have skills in self actualization, how we pursue what's meaningful to us. But how do we know what's meaningful to us? Is we have to determine the things that actually spark meaning. And that's an emotional experience. It's not an intellectual experience. And so sometimes in our conversations, we would be able to land exactly on the same page when we're talking about habits and practices that really contribute to optimum performance. And sometimes, not that we'd never be in conflict, but
Mhm.
sometimes we would have disagreements as to how to approach it, or
Mhm.
just alternate views on how to approach it. No one right or wrong, simply a different way of going after the same thing.
When there's a bit of friction
Hmm.
or disagreement in conversations, that kicks in our creativity level, done in a very civilized manner, of course. Right.
That's the primary difference between disagreeing and conflict, right?
Oh,
Conflict has the emotional undertones and relational undertones of a gap. And
okay,
so that's why we're in conflict.
so there's difference between disagreement and conflict.
Yes, very much
Okay.
so.